Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind Headlines. And in this programme tonight we'll be discussing the city of Portland, which is Oregon in the west coast of the United States, where we are seeing that lawlessness is dominating the city of Portland. Why? Because the governing authorities have decided to implement a liberal, progressive agenda of decriminalising drug use. As a result, we are seeing that the city of Portland has a drug epidemic, we're seeing it has a crime epidemic, and we're seeing it's become a city of lawlessness. And this is a warning to us in the West and in this country of the dangers of decriminalising drugs. And we'll be asking in this programme, is this another fulfilment of biblical prophecy? Regan, it's great to have you and see you again for Behind the Headlines as we discuss the city of Portland, but also the state of Oregon, introducing some of the most progressive liberal ideas on any place in the entire Western world with absolutely dire and devastating consequences.
Yeah, it's very important, Simon. I have a couple of very dear friends in Portland involved in ministry, and a couple in downtown Portland, and they, in their ministry, in their service, in their church, have a first-hand view of some of these people sleeping in tents right in front of, it's like a shop front where their church meets down in downtown. There's drug usage that's rife in their doorway. Literally, there's been drive-by shootings, all sorts of the word that you've used already, lawlessness, on full display. But the issue is, and this is what is up for discussion really, it's lawlessness before God, it's lawlessness before any rational human being. But technically, what's on display in Portland is essentially a decriminalization of these particular attitudes, actions, addictions, and the usage of drugs that have previously been illegal. So they've now made lawful what was once unlawful. But you can't change the heart, you can't change the definition of lawlessness. Just because a law changes in terms of legislation doesn't change the reality of the substance of what's going on. So our lives being destroyed by drugs after the decriminalization, absolutely. We were told by progressives that this would fix the problem, that this would end turf wars. It hasn't really even done that.
Murders have increased. Exactly. I mean, they're saying that there's been 101 murders committed that were drug-related in Portland back in 2022, and that is up from 92 in the year 2021, ever since the state of Oregon had a referendum to decriminalise hard drug use. So it just shows you that some of these liberal ideas, and why this is relevant is because we're already seeing that government drug czars in this country are suggesting that the government decriminalise drugs. This is a policy being adopted by the Scottish National Party up in Scotland, and it's become like popular amongst the liberal left progressives. And the reason why we're doing this programme today is to say these are the dangers. This is the prophetic warning going out from this programme regarding the dangers of decriminalising drug use, particularly hard drug use. And of course, what we unpack through this programme creates almost a nightmare dystopian society at work. That this is what happens when you just cast off all moral restraint. And it's the Bible that is the foundation of our society. And when you decide that you think you're more cleverer than God, and when you think you're more cleverer than the actual 10 Commandments and what the 10 Commandments say, and that we can introduce policies as our own liking because this seems like a good idea, then there are absolutely devastating consequences. And one of those consequences, sadly, is the lawlessness that we're seeing in Portland today.
There are two realities that are in tension here. There's the reality that as Christians, we need to strive for what is good, right, and true. We need to seek the good of the city, and we need to encourage others to. We need to even actively where possible, encourage and you could say even campaign for righteous legislation that has its role in seeking the good of the city. At the same time, the other truth that we hold in tension is the reality that Jesus said in the latter times there will be times of difficulty. Do not be troubled. Do not fear. Because these times are going to come. In the end days, there will be an increase of lawlessness. So while we continue to strive for faithfulness and we continue to strive to uphold the righteousness of God, and we continue to warn against lawlessness, as is right, and call people to repentance, we also recognize the inevitability of lawlessness increasing and should definitely seek to fight against it.
And of course the compassionate heart to reach out to those people that
Yes.
have drug addictions in Portland, and particularly in the state of Oregon, where people are in a desperate situation. They have no hope, they have no future, they're effectively walking zombies, and they desperately need spiritual help, because the only answer to their problems is Jesus. And if we look at some of the issues, so we see that the US city of Portland in Oregon has become a city of lawlessness. It is crime riddled after the state authorities decided to decriminalize all drug use, including use of hard drugs, in line with progressive liberal thinking. Now the once beautiful city of Portland has a hard drug pandemic, rising crime problems, including increasing homicide rates and a terrible prostitution problems, as we see from the pictures there. Drug addicts are more like zombies, addicted to crack, and resemble a nightmare dystopian future society, but the danger of this could be exported to the UK due to the government's drug experts and the Scottish nationalists who want to decriminalise all drug use up in Scotland. And in the city of Portland is a dangerous example of what the Bible describes as lawlessness that will increase in the last days. Do you want to share a little bit about the history of Portland? Now, I haven't been to the west coast of the United States. I've been to Vancouver in British Columbia in Canada, which is only a few hundred miles north of Portland, because then above it you've got the state of Washington with its capital Seattle, and then not very far away you've got there above it is the British Columbia. Now, having visited that area in British Columbia, it's just incredibly beautiful. Beautiful mountains, beautiful trees, beautiful lakes. So I can imagine that, for example, Oregon as a state must be a very beautiful state. Maybe a slightly better climate in terms of not as hot as California, but a beautiful state to actually live in and dwell in, which now has become dystopian.
I likewise have not been to Portland, but have seen some movies that have been based in Portland, and as I mentioned, have friends and know a bit about it, but it's known as, we have these nicknames for cities and states. It's known as the City of Roses because of flowers which bloom in and across the area. It's in Multnomah County, northwestern Oregon. It's the state's largest city, lying just south of Vancouver, Washington, on the Willamette River near its confluence with the Columbia River, about 100 miles by river from the Pacific Ocean. Portland is the focus of this large urban sprawl that, in addition to Vancouver, includes such Oregon cities even as Beaverton and Gresham. Beaverton often known because of its connections with Nike as well. And there's also Oregon State University, which is in Beaverton, and it's a university town, essentially. Today, the population of Portland is around 2.5 million people, known for being a liberal city, closely identifying with the politics of the Democrats, whilst the east of the state of Oregon sees itself being more aligned with the Republicans, and of course the east is also more remote. This is often what you find in the United States. The more rural areas tend to lean more to the red side of things, Republicans, whilst the Democrats more vote blue.
Yeah, and according to Britannia, the history of Portland was found by Lewis and Clark expedition, passed near the site on the Columbia River back in 1805 to 1806. The city was laid out in 1845 after two of its early citizens flipped a penny, was named for Portland, Maine, rather than Boston, Massachusetts.
So it could have been Boston, Oregon.
Yeah, which was been a bit funny. 2 Bostons.
It would have been odd,
yeah. So I'm glad they decided to go for Portland. Said early growth was stimulated by a number of gold rushes and the flow of immigrants along the Oregon Trail. Now, I remember doing a program with you before, and we're talking about the kind of gold rush era, and really what attracted the new American pioneers to carry out what was known then as the Manifest Destiny, to conquer the West, which is all this whole story about the Wild West, and how it's kind of rooted in greed, essentially, and wanting to enrich themselves, a very individualistic, almost narcissist view that they want to find the gold, become rich, and become wealthy.
There was an old Atari style game called the Oregon Trail that you can still find it on Google. You can just type it in and there's a website and you can play it, and basically it's called the Oregon Trail. Just type in the Oregon Trail game and you'll find it, and it gives you scenarios and you choose and you have to make the right choice. You have a wagon train and a family and all of this, and you have to try to make it to Oregon to find gold before others get there, before all of your family and your character that you play die. Interesting, very educational game, but it really sums up kind of that gold lust that was very much part of the heart of the Wild West. This is how the West was born. The discovery of gold saw masses of immigration to the West, not only of those just who had family become part of the colonies maybe a couple centuries before, but we also see that there was a very large population, and continues to this day, of Chinese immigrants. The city's area grew in the 1890s when it annexed surrounding communities, and the 1905 exposition celebrating the 100th anniversary of Lewis and Clark's arrival brought the city national attention. And Portland's position at the junction of the Columbia River and the main north-south route from California to Puget Sound made it a valuable commercial center, handling the farm and forest produce of the Cascade Range, Willamette River Valley, and Columbia River Basin. And the construction of deepwater port facilities capable of harboring ocean-going vessels, the completion of the North Pacific Transcontinental Railroad, which was largely had a massive amount of Chinese immigrant workers on that, often depicted in almost any historically accurate film of that day or that was dealing with that kind of era. The introduction of cheap hydroelectric power as well encouraged industry during World War II, Portland becoming a major shipbuilding center with successful urban revitalization programs undertaken in the 70s and 80s, making it really a place with a lot of potential and definitely surrounded by a lot of natural beauty.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at this very short CBN news item that looks at how far Portland has gone in terms of lawlessness.
Folks here in Eastern Oregon will tell you there are really 2 Oregons. They point to a mostly liberal Western Oregon and a mostly conservative Eastern Oregon. These 2 regions are separated by much more than the majestic Cascade Mountain Range. The western part is dominated by Portland, an urban bastion of progressive policy that prides itself on being weird. Portland is also plagued by epidemic levels of crime, drug abuse, homelessness, and mental illness. Because of its large population, Portland drives state politics. Portland's leaders have become state leaders, and Portland's progressive policies have become state policies. That's resulted in drug legalization, gun control, gender, and environmental laws being forced on the very conservative communities of rural Eastern Oregon.
So, I mean, you can even see there, Simon, from some of the aerial drone footage, the natural beauty that's there. It's quite reflective of a lot of the United States, where there's vast swathes of uninhabited territory and these idyllic-looking cities, but Portland itself, tragically, is unable to currently live up to its promise and potential. According to a Sun newspaper story published online on the 29th of December, under the headline title of "Walking Dead, Rotting Crack Zombies, Record Murders and Sex Sold for $20 in Squalid Tents, the city that turned a blind eye to drugs," we read that there were 101 murders in Portland in 2022, exceeding the 92 in 2021. Grant Rowling, the journalist writing for the Sun newspaper, describes Portland in the following way. "Zombie-eyed and writhing on the streets, a groaning man collapses on the pavements of Portland in Oregon, but passers-by barely give him a glance."
And it's interesting, I had to look up the word writhing there because I wasn't sure what it meant.
Okay.
And the dictionary is one of like, it describes that of like maggots.
Yeah.
Withering around on the ground.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a very powerful word to describe that people there are completely out of control with the drug problem in Portland, Oregon. It also says that they have grown used to the sight of bedraggled addicts who huddle in sleeping bags, sending clouds of smoke from crystal meth into the winter air among a sea of tents where sex workers carry out their trade under the watchful eye of pimps. Once a hipster paradise that prompted the cable satire Portlandia, which told of residents obsessing about barista-made coffee and bike share schemes. This liberal Northwest Coast city now looks like a nightmare dystopia. This is because 2 years ago, back in 2021, Portland decriminalised all drugs, including heroin, cocaine, crystal meth, and phenyl, under which is known as Measure 110, so Measure 110.
Can I just put this in a bit of context? You know, we had in London, a city of approaching 10 million people, maybe some people, depending on how they want to define London, might say about 8 million, but 8 to 10 million people. We had 109 murders last year. Far too many, yes. It was down from 132 the previous year. But Portland had 101 murders. They only have a population of 641,162, a fraction of what we have in terms of population. With 641,162, which I remind you, U.S. states are significantly different size and layout than our own cities in the United Kingdom. But it's significantly greater murder to population ratio in Portland than we have in London. And yet we do have a recognition of the problems, the increasing problems with violence on our streets, with drug problems even on our streets. So imagine if that was multiplied many, many times. That's what Portland is experiencing right now. Still, to some degree, there's that element of the hipsterdom of Portland. It kind of has a reputation that lingers on a little bit of that. But unfortunately, hipster culture has increasingly become walking hand in hand with this type of drug usage and behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it starts off with being soft on cannabis. And
Yes.
then you kind of decriminalise cannabis use. And then you've got a big problem with hard drugs, and then the situation gets far worse. So the Democratic authorities in the state of Oregon decided to introduce Measure 110, known as the Drug Addiction Treatment and Recovery Act, in November 2020. Oregon voters passed the referendum called Measure 110, or the Drug Addiction Treatment and Recovery Act, by 60%. And you can actually go onto the Oregon's governmental health website for more information. They say here that the Drug Addiction Treatment and Recovery Act reduces the penalty for possessing small amounts of illegal drugs in Oregon. starting on February the 1st, 2021. Instead of getting arrested, people get a citation. Citations may have a $100 fine, and people can complete a health assessment to avoid paying the fine. Essentially, this was the democratic US state deciding to pursue liberal, progressive agenda on drugs, controlled by decriminalising all hard drug use in the state, especially in the city of Portland.
According to The Spectator, in November of 2020, Oregon passed Measure 110 legislation decriminalizing non-commercial drug possession. The state also significantly increased its funding for recovery and harm reduction programs. At the time, it sounded like a great plan to voters, somehow, and it passed with 60% approval. What's occurred, though, in the 3 years since is nothing short of tragic. Okay, we still had, across the U.S., multiple COVID measures in place. Isolation, doubtless, would not have helped this by any means, but by the time Measure 110 passed, fentanyl was already beginning to take over the streets. Measure 110 recognized the problem, but it only presented a band-aid to the gaping wound of the problem that fentanyl was presenting. For homeless addicts, it began as general curiosity, as most drugs do. Often, some of these individuals may not have been homeless even before they took it, but people, through various means, various pressures, maybe desire to forget, desire to have a new high, people acting like this is the latest thing you need to try. They started indulging that curiosity, which devolves into widespread use of what is, inarguably, one of the deadliest drugs in history. Fentanyl is 50 times stronger than heroin, and with two major competing cartels, namely China and Mexico, the price has dropped to an all-time low. 3 years ago, a blue fentanyl pill cost about $6 to $7 and is dropped now to between $1 and $2. Nearly all street-level addicts use fentanyl and have turned the city of Portland into what is called the largest open-air drug zone in state history.
And this drug is essentially used for major keyhole surgery operations. So they give it to the patients.
I've had fentanyl for operations and treatment. It's very strong.
Yeah, 50 times as strong as heroin. We know in the Second World War that morphine was used when soldiers were badly injured to take away the pain. So, if this is then 50 times strong, and we know that heroin, it comes from this particular drug, morphine. So then if it's 50 times stronger than heroin and even more addictive, it's almost impossible getting people off it. And especially the price as well is so low that people on the homeless feel like, well, I've got nothing else to live for. I can afford this drug, it's very cheap, and end up getting addicted to it. And of course, this is causing the state of lawlessness that we're seeing in Portland today. Also says it took 34 months for the first promised recovery programs with medical detox facilities to open with Measure 110. Money, and in that time, there has been a record number of overdoses and deaths. Despite the lack of new infrastructure, there's been empty beds in those detox facilities from day one because Portland does not have enough outreach teams to fill them. So,
but also, could I just suggest, a lot of the addicts don't have any interest in rehab. So it's like, all of the emphasis is on they don't have enough outreach teams to fill them. Well, I know just from my observance in London and from working with addicts, you can't lead a horse, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. In the same way, you can bring a drug addict to a rehab center, but it doesn't change the issue. It doesn't change the problem. They might take the bed for the night, but they'll be off taking again in the morning.
But also we see with this one is that they haven't thought through the practical ramifications of such a liberal, progressive policy of decriminalising hard drug use. So effectively, they haven't provided enough detox centres. They haven't had enough teams to help those people with the problem. And effectively, there you take away the deterrent, which is arrest, a criminal offence, and also they seem to forget that the whole issue to do with drugs is a criminal activity in the first place. So you can't take out the criminality when you decriminalise drugs. And of course, this is why murder rates go through the roof. This is why theft and stealing goes through the roof. This is why we're seeing such abuse and such human misery all because some bright sparks thought it would be a very good idea to decriminalise drugs. And let's go and have a look now at this excellent CBN news report warning this is a very distressing news report of the drug addiction that is taking place in Portland, Oregon.
Good morning from the beautiful city of Portland, Oregon.
These are images and video from an army of citizen journalists in Portland who have been documenting a city in decline. Public drug abuse, addicts sprawled on the sidewalks or wandering the streets, tent encampments on many street corners, and fires seen burning along the roadways. What used to be one of America's most beautiful and livable cities is being slowly destroyed by epidemic levels of crime, drug abuse, homelessness, and mental illness. One local is called Portland an open-air insane asylum. We went to one of Portland's many tent encampments with drug and alcohol counselor Kevin Dahlgren, who's trying to help the city's addicts. Many of the tents you see here are supplied by Multnomah County. Dahlgren believes at least some officials are okay with what's happened to the city.
How could they not be okay with it for as long as this has gone on, right? Every day we walk past these camps, we see people languishing and dying on the streets. That is not okay. Every year we say this is a state of emergency, right? But who here is treating it like in a true state of emergency?
Dahlgren says activists actually put up empty tents to attract more tents.
That is a common practice, to erect tents to invite homeless to be homeless, right? And that makes our job now 10 times harder. They will just erect the tents in hopes that a person will find the tent and move inside.
During our time with Dahlgren, he met one homeless man who said he was given a bus ticket to Portland by the city of Billings, Montana. Portland has become a mecca for addicts and drug dealers who have migrated here from across the country to take advantage of weak drug laws. It's also attracted drug cartels. There were 11 drug overdoses on March 31st alone, and one pill of fentanyl can cost as little as $1.
I feel like we've invited people to come to our city to kill themselves.
A Portland photographer who goes by the street name of Michelle Ghost has been capturing the decline of the city through her lens.
We're giving them the tools that they need to stay alive just long enough to end up dying on our streets.
After rioting over George Floyd's death resulted in the destruction of large parts of Portland in 2020, Mayor Ted Wheeler thanked the rioters before he was hit with tear gas. Things got worse for the city when Oregon voters approved Measure 110. It decriminalized possession of small amounts of drugs, making it a health care issue and not a crime. Police officials say it's led to a huge increase in the amount of drugs on the streets, which has led to a surge in crime. It wasn't always like this.
Portland, Oregon, one of the nation's most beautiful cities. The citizens of Portland attend many fine churches. It is a family town, a good place to bring up children.
In Portland today, a viral video shows a man using drugs in front of a child. Just last week, a man beat someone with a golf club in front of this Portland restaurant. The nervous owners then offered the attacker hot coffee, which he dumped on the victim. 79% of businesses surveyed in Portland have been victims of vandalism or break-ins. 19% have been vandalized at least 5 times.
Our business has been vandalized over half a dozen times. We've had 5 burglaries in our business. We've had over $100,000 worth of impact.
Walmart and Cracker Barrel are part of a wave of businesses that have fled the city. More than 2,600 downtown businesses have left.
I'm very frustrated with what's going on.
Tech company owner Gabe Johnson is also looking to relocate.
By us continuing to keep our business in the Multnomah County and the Portland city limits, we are giving money to the problem. And so we're going to move.
Portland's social experiment, this progressive experiment, has gone colossally bad.
Jeff and Angela are Portland business owners and community reporters with PDX Real.
I can't stress it enough. It has impacted everything from our banks are being broken into, ATMs are being stolen. We have people that are just going to work, walking in their neighborhood, being assaulted.
It's like it's in some sort of like controlled demolition, really. And when I say that, it's because a lot of this stuff comes from policy.
Lax laws against car theft have made stealing cars a growth industry in Portland. 1 out of every 2 police stops in the city involves a stolen car. We went to one of Portland's former CHOP sites with Nick Haas, the founder of Guardians Theft Recovery, a community-based group that has helped recover more than 700 stolen vehicles.
This is the site of the Midway CHOP operation. The Midway CHOP operated for about 6 to 9 months, and our crew estimates about 250 to 300 stolen vehicles were illegally processed and cut up into pieces at this site. And they knew that there was basically catch and release. If you got caught with a stolen vehicle, you're going to get booked, you're going to get held for about 48 hours, you're going to get put back out on the street. So it kind of became like a candy land for them.
Critics call Portland the poster child for what happens when progressive policy goes too far. Portland officials are now conducting tent sweeps to clean up the city, and some believe Portland may be turning the corner. But drug abuse, homelessness, and crime remain high.
Imagine, absent some of the decay we've seen, what a great place it could be to live.
MC Street Truth is the alias of a Portland businessman who co-founded the Coalition to Save Portland with Gabe Johnson.
I remember when we used to celebrate the idea that Portland's weird. This is kind of how it is. It's weird, it's quirky. It's not funny anymore. We'd like to go back to where Portland was just weird. Now it's scary.
One writer asked, how long does it take for a city to die? Dale Hurd, CBN News, Portland.
Dale's reports always are kind of like visual throat punches in a way. They really are hard-hitting reports, very incisive and insightful. So thank you, Dale, for the insights there. I mean, tragic scenes, the tent cities, the public drug taking, you know, with reckless abandon, very little hope. People living in squalor, lawlessness, that's the only word, where everything that's wrong is going on in broad daylight and it seems unabated.
I mean, it seems similar to what my wife and I experienced in Vancouver when we had probably the holiday of a lifetime visiting British Columbia and driving through places like to Banff and then onto the Rockies. Absolutely incredible. But remember staying in Vancouver and you know, whether it's Vancouver or another a Canadian or US state, you take a one turn wrong in the wrong place in the one block, and we found ourselves in this street of homeless people. So very similar to the scenes we saw there with people sleeping in tents and shopping trolleys outside. And as we were walking along early in the morning, there was one guy had a frying pan, kept banging his head with a frying pan. I mean, I know that this was kind of small in comparison to what we're seeing in Portland, but it just shows you what happens when people are on the streets, they're addicted to drugs, and it creates a spirit and an atmosphere of lawlessness. And then we see a crime pandemic emerge here. I mean, the social consequences of the impact of Oregon's state decision to decriminalize hard drugs is absolutely horrific. So they're saying now that possessing small quantities of these deadly substances no longer results in arrest, even though it's illegal to drink alcohol on the streets. The effect has been devastating. So in other words, you can take hard drugs, you can take heroin, you can take cocaine, but if you are then sitting in a park drinking a beer, that's a criminal offence.
It's estimated that the number of deaths from overdoses have risen 28% in a year. The state is now the worst in the country for young people dying from drugs. And in Multnomah County, which includes Portland, there were almost 500 drug-related deaths last year. In 2019, it was 200. The number of murders in the city reached record highs in 2022 too, as we've already mentioned, with victims gunned down in the streets and shots even fired into a hospital's A&E department. Some businesses have closed for good due to the number of violent thefts. We heard about Cracker Barrel, a place that we both have enjoyed, scattered across the United States. Very good breakfast there. And Walmart as well. There were 101 murders last year, exceeding the 92 in 2021, and far worse than the previous record of 70 in 1987. Locals point to turf wars between drug dealers as the major cause, even after decriminalization, in effect, was supposed to end. This is what liberal progressives have harped on about for years, that decriminalize drugs and we put an end to drug turf wars. It just doesn't happen that way. That's not what happens. It just reorients the drug war to a different arena. South American cartels control most of the city's drug supply, and teenagers use electric scooters to make deliveries.
That's scary, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like Uber for drugs. The thing is, Simon, that, and we'll talk more about this, I mean, it's coming here. It's already here to some degree in London. Another effect of letting heavy drug use spiral out of control is the rise in sex workers, with it being possible in the city center to find young women selling their bodies for as little as £16.
Horrible. And the way that, for example, some of these pimps will actually, traffic these young women and then get them addicted to these hard drugs and use them and destroy their lives into a life of prostitution is absolutely horrific. I mean, this reminds me of kind of the lawlessness that we saw in Sodom and Gomorrah is actually coming to a western city near us. It's frightening.
The girls are often hired out at $20 a time, maybe less. Lots of tents around with just a few dirty blankets inside where they conduct their business. Spencer, who is a ex-cop turned support worker, 49 years of age, doesn't reveal his surname, has run a project called Love One Another outreach program for the past 18 months and has helped 800 people get off the streets. Phenomenal effort. You know, seen addicts use a state-funded debit card to buy goods, which they then sell for cash to get their hands on killer substances. Spencer adds, crime is of course what funds most of the drugs, but homeless people are also entitled to a debit card which they can use to buy food, which they sell to get drugs. Auto thefts are a huge issue too. Cars are stripped regularly for things like catalytic converters.
Absolutely. And then we see that the residents of Portland are speaking out, according to this excellent article in the Sun newspaper. Say shop owners are tired of cleaning up mess caused by Measure 110. Robert Jug, who's 39, in his own of Mont Rosa Cafe, has said it's inevitable to start the day. He says, every day I start to clear out the toilet mess, obviously different language here, but I use toilet mess for our viewers, from the doorway. Now it's routine. The 110 law is what created all the problems and now should be repealed.
Others have spent huge sums of money on extra security to deter thieves. This church I was mentioning earlier, they have now a designated security guard as well. For a small community church in the downtown, they've had to enlist a security company to do that. Elizabeth Nye is executive director of the Lansu Chinese Garden. Until a 40,000-pound fence was recently installed, it was costing 16,000 pounds a month for security guards. And this is where we begin to need to drive this home for us, really, Simon. This is a warning to Britain. Eric Bauer, 66, chief executive of the Portland Rescue Mission, warns Britain not to make the same mistake. With increased talk of decriminalization of drugs here, he says decriminalization hasn't worked because there's no accountability. There has to be accountability for actions. UK, this is coming to you. Be prepared. Fentanyl gives you bodies, P2P meth gives you zombies. This is what's coming to the UK. It's a tsunami, a perfect storm, and my message is learn from us, be prepared. And yet, as we've been going through this story, Simon, I have a flood of recollections coming to me, even from what supposedly gentrified Islington, right? Okay, you can clean up, what I tell people is you can clean up the surface, it doesn't change the heart. And the reality is, on my doorstep, I've had people use the toilet routinely. under the influence. We just this week, one of our church members discovered a few people, a lady and a couple of guys, taking crack. Just on the doorstep. I've found people heating up their heroin in the doorstep as well, and other ways passing out. The smell of weed in some of the streets is all pervasive, and you just have this situation where it's going unheeded. My brother, who pastors in North London, on his Ring doorbell saw that there was some sort of activity going on outside his flat, which is attached to a church, opens the door, and there's a man with a lady there, and he's zipping up, and they're running off, and he looks in the Ring doorbell. He catches a whole deal where he is essentially arranging a deal with this drug-addicted woman for a sex act for £10. Ooh. For £10. Next, right, we're talking about on the church premises. Reported to the police. Police say no crime was committed. It's unpleasant, but no crime was committed. This is where we're at.
Which is effectively a state of lawlessness.
We're headed.
And if you actually kind of realise that Tony Blair, our former Prime Minister, rose to prominence in 1993 after saying that he would be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. So essentially, when you are decriminalising drug use, you are then allowing a high level of criminal behaviour to go unpunished. This just creates a climate of lawlessness. We saw that with the former mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, had a policy of zero tolerance, that if there were small acts of crimes being committed, this would be punishable. The result is that this had a knock-on effect on bigger crimes across the city of New York, and he was able to clean up the city. It seems that the more as a nation and the more as a society that we move away from God and God's laws and statutes, the more ungovernable and the more lawless we become, the bigger the social problems, because it's a condition of the human heart, and you can't legislate for that. Only the saving power of Jesus Christ, the forgiveness of sins, can deal and tackle this issue of sin and a broken heart. And of course, this leads to lawlessness. But give us an example of how the Scottish Nationalist Party have already called for the decriminalisation of hard drugs up in Scotland, which means that Scotland already has the biggest drug problem in Europe, and to decriminalise the use of hard drugs would make matters a million times worse if we use Portland's example.
Well, drug czars say that we're already seeing an influx of synthetic opioids such as fentanyl flooding through Britain in the coming years. It's been revealed that our government's drug advisors have privately recommended decriminalising personal drug use. Calls echoed by the SNP over the summer in Scotland, which has the highest drug-related death rate in Europe. And on an occasion when I was in Glasgow doing some outreach with a church there, Simon, I was in an area called Govan, and every single house, without exception, that I knocked on the door, there was a response, people opening the doors, going through flat blocks. There were hundreds of houses that we engaged, hundreds of people opening their doors in the course of that week. Every single one had a substance abuse problem manifest. Right. The one place where I thought we didn't have, the guy was trying to, he was kind of coyly hiding a joint, that he had just been rolling up, and he was saying he was trying to come off, and he seemed relatively clean in that way from the drugs, but this was the last bit that was hanging on. Every house had issues with either alcoholism, drug addiction, or both. And it's just a grim situation. And so the response of many is, since it's already out of control, well, let's just decriminalize it. And somehow, okay, does it make the stats look better? Yes, because you no longer have this listed as a crime. It's no longer making you look bad. It's no longer making your party look incompetent. if you change the legislation and you can accommodate for certain things, you can present, oh, we've tackled drug crime. Oh yeah, you tackled drug crime by no longer making it a crime, essentially, is what's going on. Drug addicts will be able to shoot heroin and snort cocaine in Britain's first ever legal drug consumption room. It's totally dystopian. Officials have approved these fix rooms, is what they're called, fix rooms in Scotland, to help tackle the country's drug deaths epidemic. So let's just take it and let's move it into a more controlled environment. You know, this really, it reminds me of those opium dens that used to be across China, and that we used to, that you see in old novels and whatnot here, these backstreet opium dens that the gentry used to attend, where it was slightly more controlled and slightly more, you know, the £2.3 million centre in the East End of Glasgow will allow users to take their own illegal drugs under medical supervision. Addicts will be given sterile equipment to inject and supervised by trained staff while using. The Scottish Government pushed for so-called fix rooms in 2016 after an HIV outbreak in the city. This is not the way.
No, it isn't the way. And what it does is leads to a crime pandemic. You open up these kind of free houses to take drugs illegally. It brings crime into the area. It brings poverty. It brings destruction. Of course, then also brings kind of murder and death. So you can see the issue of decriminalising drug use is having on our society will actually lead to a dystopian nightmare, as we've seen in Portland. Now, I think the bigger issue is the stuff as well is how are we allowing drug use and not having a war against it? Because, you know, we've seen in the States this is a massive problem. It's a massive problem here in the Western world, the whole use of drug use. Our government should be doing everything they can to go against this, to go against the drugs and to stop drugs coming into the country, rather than saying, oh, we need to take it out of the hands of the criminals and decriminalising it. Just makes matters even worse. We have to have a war on drugs, and we've got to win that war. And it's imperative that we do so, because look at the damage it's been doing to our society. Look what it's done to Portland, a city that could come to London. It could come to Glasgow, Edinburgh, Birmingham, Manchester, Cardiff, Belfast. There's not one place in the UK which will not be affected by this. And of course, what it does is it leads to huge social and moral problems. And essentially, you're living in a society that permits sin and embraces sin. That's essentially what we're facing.
What role would you say, Simon, Christians have to play in this?
Stand up against it, being vocal against it, pray against it, but also really showing the compassion and love of Christ to those who are addicted to the drugs to get them off. You only have to look at the amazing story of Sword and the Switchblade that took place in New York in the 1950s. Was an incredible story. What's happening also in Hong Kong as well, and others that have dedicated their lives to helping people on drugs. But we shouldn't allow liberal progressives to set the political agenda to decriminalise drugs. Otherwise, we have the apocalypse comes here.
Well, let's have another look at this report from our friends at CBN.
Tear gas, tossing Bibles into fires, and burning the American flag. Just the latest from nightly riots that have drawn thousands to this city park in front of Portland's federal courthouse. Some say they're just protesting for racial justice. Others want to defund the police nationwide. Windows were smashed, buildings defaced, and fires burned nightly around the courthouse. But Portland Mayor and Police Commissioner Ted Wheeler ignored the conduct, even joining the protesters in calling for federal police to leave the area.
The reason I'm here tonight is to stand with you no matter what. I stand with you.
So we've seen lots of different kinds of makeshift weapons out here. Shields, baseball bats, tennis rackets, green lasers, frozen water bottles, glass bottles, things like that. So the protesters beat on the doors of the federal building over here for about 10 minutes. essentially begging the cops to come out. The cops finally obliged, came out and pushed everybody back. And now it's kind of a standoff. We'll see where it goes from here. While many of the signs call for the police to be defunded or abolished, it's clear their intentions are not to increase personal freedom. Antifa agitators could be seen blocking roads and trying to limit the freedom of the press.
Film the cops, not the protesters. Film the cops, not the protesters.
When a black Trump supporter was discovered in the crowd, protesters immediately called in the mob.
I have his Instagram right here. We have your Instagram up.
It was abundantly clear most of those protesting want to become the police, not abolish them. Some local Christians have been trying to be positive in the midst of these riots.
As a leader, I'm often asked to speak. And during this entire period, I've said, I just want to listen. I have trouble with people who set fires on purpose, for people who write graffiti all over the place and stuff like that, who bash in windows and loot stores. I have a real problem with all of that. But that's why inside I'm saying, Lord, you've got to help me understand what that person sees that I don't.
Tensions eased somewhat over the weekend as federal agents were replaced by Portland police officers who must follow much more restrictive rules of engagement. But that didn't stop protesters from burning American flags and even Bibles. How that relates to racial justice wasn't immediately clear. But Pastor Hennessy says there is a role for Christians to play.
We need to pray for the ability to listen, to learn, and to find out how God wants us to engage.
From Portland, Oregon, I'm Chuck Holton for CBN News.
So put that news report in context, thanks to our friends at CBN. That was taken in the summer of 2020 with the Black Lives Matter protests. And of course, then we saw that the city of Portland took the lead in those Black Lives Matter protests and essentially called for the police to be defunded and to remove the police force. So once you move God's authority that he's placed, you get lawlessness. And of course, we see a natural correlation between the BLM Black Lives Matter protests, defund the police, remove the police force, and now we have the liberal progressives who are governing the state of Oregon wanting to decriminalise drug use with Measure 110. And of course, the consequence of that, we have a zombie controlled, crime-infested city that is a warning to the rest of the world and the West of the dangers of decriminalising hard drugs.
Simon, there are so many warnings that we see from Portland, and I fear we are already well on our way to replicating what's going on here. Thankfully, there is, I still believe, a chance of being able to hold it at bay. At the same time, we are very conscious of the Scripture's teaching, and it's important that we prepare ourselves accordingly, that while we seek to engage, as the pastor was indicating there, while we seek to effectively and meaningfully engage, and while we seek to even resist this where possible, we recognize this is where things are going prior to the coming again of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ.
As in the days of Noah.
Absolutely. It's a question as to whether or not we're seeing that happen right now. Or can we discern that this is happening right now? I think we probably can. There's so many other situations that we normally do address also here on Behind the Headlines that are pointing to that reality. But in Matthew 13:41, the Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness. 2 Corinthians 6:14, do not be bound together with unbelievers. For what partnership have righteousness and lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness? So, Christian, please do not advocate for decriminalization. Simon, I'm encountering people who profess faith in Christ saying this is a good thing. They're advocating for the decriminalization of abortion, advocating for the decriminalization of euthanasia, advocating for the decriminalization of drugs, advocating for the decriminalization of prostitution, and these are people who profess Christ.
Absolutely. And also we have to recognize that drug use is Satan's weapon. to destroy mankind, to destroy society, to give people that feel like they've lost hope, that kind of chemical high that only lasts for a small moment, and then we see their lives are completely destroyed. One of the classic examples, it says in 1 John 3 verse 4, that anyone who practices sin also practices lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness, and exactly what we're dealing with in Portland. And in Matthew 24, Jesus' own words in verse 12, because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. So as we see the rise of lawlessness overtake our nations and our society, then we see that people's love grows cold. People become hard, and their hearts become hardened, and they become hardened to the gospel. So this is clearly a strategic weapon being used by Satan to enslave millions of people, not only in this country, but around the world.
And as Christians, we mustn't allow that reality to make our love grow cold. That's one of the temptations and one of the trials we will have to kick against, where we might grow weary in doing good, but we mustn't do that, because in due season we will reap a harvest if we faint not. 2 Peter 2:8, for by what he saw and heard, that righteous man, while living among them, referring to Lot, felt his righteous soul tormented day after day by their lawless deeds. There in Sodom and Gomorrah. In 2 Thessalonians 2:7, for the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. Well, there's the scriptural reminders, and I think from what we see in Portland, we have a situation that very much epitomizes lawlessness, and where we can be headed, where I believe we are headed right now in this situation. Thanks, Simon, for this program, and do you have any final?
Yeah, I just want to thank you for watching today's program. I think what we're seeing in Portland is a prophetic warning to us here in Britain of the dangers of decriminalising hard drugs, as many of our liberal politicians wish to do so. We need to fight this war against drugs, and we need to give those drug users hope in Jesus Christ. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Behind the Headlines.